Ukraine and its economy. We're joined by Charles Ortel. He's the managing director at Newport Value Partners. Charles, always a pleasure. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Charles, today the EU said to Ukraine that they will not give peacekeeping forces, despite Ukraine's concerns that there could be a fresh buildup of Russian-supported troops. Do you think that this is a mistake from the EU's perspective?
I don't think so. I mean, I think they're facing an emboldened Russia, even though Putin has been slapped pretty hard by declining energy prices, who's right next door. He can easily move as much force as he wants against the Ukraine to counter anything that the EU might send. And the EU has not exactly been successful, nor has the US, with intervention of late anywhere.
So you don't think that this would create more of a notion of stability should there be some kind of peacekeeping force there?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you were to reassure anybody, we should be reassuring people who have not yet been pinched by the Russians, the Poles, the Baltic states, et cetera. But I think at this stage, with it's so unsettled in the Ukraine, what's the plan for victory?
Well, the economy seems to be picking up somewhat, and the European Commission President Juncker said today that the EU was happy to continuing supporting Ukraine. He said, "You keep reforming, we'll keep supporting." How have Poroshenko's reforms been playing out so far?
I think some of them have worked pretty well. I mean, there's a very interesting report about how the reform in the most visible way in which Ukrainians are touched in traffic. And when I traveled in the Ukraine, my driver was stopped many times. They've changed that to make it a much more palatable experience where there's not as much of a shakedown. They've cut the bureaucracy. They're being more efficient with the taxes. So some of the reforms are working, but they haven't, I don't think, done enough to think through what makes Ukraine's economy distinctively competent against other countries around the world.
Well, one thing that has made it distinctively incompetent has been this notion of corruption, and that has plagued Ukraine back to Soviet times. In fact, back in 2003, Ukraine was ranked number 144 out of 177 in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Corruption, a big problem, like you said, with the traffic, that police were very much involved with getting handouts, if you will. So what can be done to change this? Is any reform that has been implemented so far built any traction on tackling the corruption issue?
I don't think so. I mean, I think when you're sitting it geographically the way they are, a country that is reasonably poor but is close to the heart of Europe, it's a great opportunity to smuggle things into the black market into Europe. And the land borders are pretty porous, actually, as between Ukraine and most of the bordering states. So you've got, all the recipes for corruption, a history of corruption, and, how are you going to teach people not to be corrupt?
So what about all this money that the EU and the IMF has poured into Ukraine? How has that been used so far?
Well, what the reports are, it's always difficult to tell because money is fungible, but the reports are that it was routed through a lot of these NGOs. And, as we see in other large foundations around the world, it's very difficult to see how much of the money you send to an NGO to get to its intended purpose actually reaches it.
Today, well, on Friday, rather, we heard from the head of Ukraine's National Bank, Valeria Gontareva, and she said that Ukraine's economic recession has, in fact, hit its bottom, that there will be a recovery from the second quarter of 2015. What do you make of this? Is the worst over for Ukraine?
Well, I think not. I mean, when you look at where their currency is now, yes, it's not as weak as it once was, but the last time I was in Ukraine, $1 only got you 8.2 of the local currency, which I have difficulty pronouncing.
Well, the dollar, the hryvnia, has stabilized significantly against the dollar this year.
Well, but it's still 22 to the dollar.
But what has been driving the stabilization? There's been money pouring out of the country. There's been a big flight of capital. What would possibly incentivize investors to come into Ukraine?
Well, the fact that the currency is just a fraction of what it once was, the fact that, for some people looking at the natural resources, looking at the farmland, it's knocked down. And so there are vulture buyers who like to go in and take great risks. But I wouldn't call a bottom yet at all in the Ukraine.
If Ukraine's economy fails, is this a big propaganda coup for Russia and for Putin? Is the majority of the incentive behind propping up Ukraine's economy to, well, stick it to Russia, if you will?
I think from the U.S. standpoint, we definitely, I believe the folks in Washington, D.C. definitely want to stick it to Russia. Russia's sitting there hoping that more aid comes into the Ukraine because the money will go in And once it goes in, Russia will then change the deal on natural gas pricing, terms for that. So,
but what if Ukraine's economy succeeds in turning things around, like Poland did, for example? What kind of message does that send to Russians?
Well, Poland's a very different story, one I know a lot about because the firm I used to work for, we were involved in getting the country back up and running. It's a homogenous country. We had a lot of time in the West to pour tons of money into it, and we did something very smart, and that is we transferred wealth to all the Poles through the National Investment Fund process, which took a number of years. So they've been long in going the right way. They're naturally more allied to the West than I think Ukraine has been over many, many decades. Ukraine is still, I mean, Russia still owns territory that was Ukrainian.
And you can call it comical almost, but Ukraine is asking the EU for membership. I mean, the EU's got the EU's got a lot going on. Is that just completely audacious that they're even putting that on the table?
I think it is, and I think we should listen as well to what Mr. Putin's reaction on the other side. I mean, they're rattling sabers about nuclear war over that. And when you go in the long history of Russia, it really dates back 1,000 years. Ukraine is far more integral to Russia than, you know, certain states are the border of the United States to the United States.
Well, you've always been a proponent of Putin not giving up on Ukraine. I see you're sticking to that view, Charles. We're going to have to leave it there. Charles Ortel, Managing Director at Newport Value Partners.